Are you ready to buy a house or thinking about it? Well, you don't want to make a big mistake. We've got you covered. We're going to cover the biggest mistakes people make when buying their first house. So if you have a friend who's thinking about buying a house, share this with them so they don't make a mistake either. Welcome to the Landis Look, where we take an inside look at the world of real estate. And I'm here with Jarrod to help us go over the biggest mistakes first-time home buyers make. Jarrod, welcome.
Justin, thanks for having me.
Great, man. Good to see you. Let's get into the mistakes that people make when buying houses. Mistake number one is what?
They don't talk to a lender first.
Why would I talk to a lender first? I just want to go look at the houses. That's the most fun part.
It is the most fun part. And full confession, I've done this. I've made this mistake. Because everything's online, Justin, and you play with the mortgage calculator and you think, oh, I've made all the right assumptions. I'm pretty close. This should be fine. But the problem is—
the mortgage calculator might not be actually what your mortgage would be.
Believe it or not, yes, you have to actually go in there and get the taxes and insurance and all those other things right. So yeah, I learned that one the hard way.
Yeah, so the mortgage calculator is not right. And there are things that could be different for everyone that isn't on the mortgage calculator. Each person is different and each property is different. So that can also vary.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of these things tie into one of our future points. But yeah, there are a lot of variables that go into your monthly payment other than just the price of the house.
Yeah, for sure. And so let's tie into the next point. So we've not made the first mistake. We have talked to a lender, so that's good. But here's the second mistake people make, and I think they make this one maybe even more. The second mistake is?
The second mistake is they only look at the interest rate.
Yes. And why is it a mistake to only look at the interest rate? Wouldn't it be better to have a 2.75% interest rate than a 3% interest rate? How could that not be better?
Yeah, no. Well, the interest rate is what everyone talks about, right? The news reports it. You hear commercials about how low interest rates are, or maybe even specifically what the rates are. But there's usually those little stars or those little caveats that you don't really get into until you actually start communicating with a lender about your specific situation. And a lot of it has to do with how long you're going to be in the house. So in other words, the cost or the closing costs associated with getting that, that bottom barrel interest rate may not be worth it unless you're going to be in the house sometimes 5, 6, 7 or more years.
Tell people because there's the interest rate and then there's closing costs. What are closing costs and how do they impact the interest rate?
Yeah, so closing costs are costs that are in addition to your down payment that are due at closing. And they're typically paid by the buyer unless we negotiate the seller to pay them on the buyer's behalf. But yeah, so there's two levels there. And so as interest rates, the lower your interest rate, the higher your closing costs are going to be, and vice versa. And so in order to get that low interest rate, you're probably going to have close to the maximum amount of closing costs, which is typically 3%. But a lot of people are willing to make the trade for a slightly higher interest rate to keep the cash that they'll need to bring to closing a little bit lower.
So you can pay less at closing and have a higher rate, which means you pay more over time, or you can pay more at closing and have a lower interest rate, which lowers your payment over time. But there is a break-even point that you have to do a little bit of math to figure out which one is better. And that partially depends, like you said, how long you're going to stay in the house. But that math is basically how much am I saving each month to make up for the difference that I paid more up front. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And so sometimes if you play with those interest rates, an eighth of a point may only save you $20 a month. So that's only a few $100s a year. So, it can take several years or more to make up even just a couple $1,000s in the difference in closing costs.
And why is this so confusing when looking at multiple lenders? Because I've seen this so many times where people are confused looking at different quotes from different lenders to see which one is better. Why is that so confusing?
That's a great question. I definitely think it's best to look at quotes across the board from the same lender. But the initial way that lenders present it is different. But you can get what's called a good faith estimate, which is the same format and the same criteria. And that way you can have a better chance. It's just much easier to compare apples to apples with a true good faith estimate.
Yeah, because some closing costs, the lender controls. Other closing costs, they're putting estimates in and they don't actually control it. So, I mean, I see that a lot of times where people are like, hey, it's $1,000 less over here. But the reason it's $1,000 less is the lender has estimated differently, but they don't actually have any control over it. And so that's why it's important to compare apples to apples. So, Jarrod, thanks for helping people avoid these mistakes. Talk to a lender. And then once you talk to the lender, you got to look at the total picture of the financing, not just the interest rate. So avoid these mistakes. Don't mess up your money. Talk to a lender. Avoid the interest rate mistake. And we'll be back with more tips on how to make your best first-time home purchase and avoid mistakes. Thanks, y'all.